welcome back to the shed. It's Neal Whitman, and I'm going to be starting on a little conversation going through Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to engage with Dr. Peterson and to really sound out some of his arguments. Probably a lot of you are not read in on this particular work, but you may have listened to Jordan Peterson in many of his talks, and you may be familiar with the enormous impact he's had on the conversation surrounding the modern wokeism and sort of our defeatist culture. So, and of course his biblical series in which he brought that forward and sort of psychologized it. So I thought it was really a worthwhile investigation, and I'm not in the least disappointed as I've started to go on this little journey and read through his latest book. So before I get into talking at great length on the nature of this particular introduction, I wanted to tell a story which will be explained later as I go through his Rule 1. And his Rule 1, just as a matter of perhaps teaser information so you can follow me through, is to not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. So the story I wanted to tell you, which may at first seem somewhat unrelated, has to do with a circumstance when I was in Afghanistan in 2007. We were in the midst of a place that was very tricky to get to, Nalgam, in Zari district, which was known as the birthplace of the Taliban movement. And we'd managed to get in there, patrolling on foot from a place to the east. I was in the eastern town of Kolk for about 24 hours into the patrol with all the armored vehicles leaguered up. And then we moved down up north to the Ring Road and down south into Nalgam, having scouted it out and secured the route in with our armored recce battle group assets having supported us in that. And the first night that we were in there, the guys were patrolling around, and there was one individual from one of the Patricia attached platoons that we had who stumbled into a well. And to give you a picture of this, the wells in Afghanistan, you could probably drive a car into a lot of them. They were quite large, big squares cut out of the earth, and this particular one went down 70 feet, which we knew because of sending ropes down to try and get this guy back out. And he'd fallen down, and it was a dry well. Now, being a jumper, parachutist, in training, he landed using a proper landing. He had the wherewithal, despite of falling down in the darkness, to properly brace himself and roll with the fall. And he wasn't killed on impact, but obviously he was really badly dinged up. And it was quite a situation, because we were out there in the middle of this place. We didn't have climbing ropes or safety harnesses with us. It's not the kind of thing you generally worry about having on hand in a desert agriculture environment. And so it was a serious situation. Like, this guy had fallen an enormous distance. We'd assumed for a while that he may have died because he was not immediately responsive. And then when he was able to communicate to some extent that he was still hanging on down there, we couldn't possibly know the extent of his injuries. You know, the medic there was trying to get him to self-assess, and it wasn't clear whether he'd broken his legs or if he might have, you know, it didn't seem to be evidence of a compound fracture immediately, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't suffering from significant internal bleeding. So the clock's ticking, right, to try and get this guy back out. And obviously very tense because we're in a hostile environment, and there is a very real possibility when you're in the midst of trying to do a recovery in such a situation that our enemies could have taken advantage of that while our guard was down and struck. So obviously there was a great deal of anxiety in the midst of that situation. Now, essentially what happened was that we managed to get a bunch of tow straps, tie them together. We had a gator with us that we were using, one of those six-wheeled with all-terrain vehicles with a little truck bed on the back of it for toting around supplies. And we're using that for dismounted resupply of water and ammunition on the dismounted patrol. So we got that out to where he was because none of the bigger vehicles could get in there. And we tied all the cargo straps together. And there was a fella that we hooked up to a harness and lowered him down into the well on these tow straps and tied to the back of the gator. And the gator just kind of put itself in idle and slowly worked its way back as he walked down the wall of the well and got to the bottom, where he found this guy who'd been pretty badly busted up. And he grabbed him and tied him into a harness and basically carried him as gently as he could back out while he walked up the wall as the gator went and pulled them away. And we managed to extract him. It took, I remember it being an awful long time, but probably an hour and a half by the time we got him back out, after having got everything together and sorted that out. And the whole time I was back with the heavy vehicles on the horn sorting out medevac. Once we got him up and had his vital signs, they launched a Black Hawk helicopter with escorts, and that showed up. And we had guys, I arranged for the HLZ with the Sergeant Major went and oversaw, and where the helicopter landing zone was, for this helicopter to come into a field, basically for an austere landing, to pick up our casualty and evacuate him to medical care. And yeah, not that this is particularly mundane or germane to the story, I should say, but when the chopper was coming in, one of the Apache escorts radioed me and asked, even though we had a guy with a nightstick doing the buzzsaw on a string to indicate the landing zone, he asked me if he could illume the LZ, and I said, yeah, Roger. You know, not really understanding what he was asking. And then he fired a infrared flare out of the rocket pod at the landing zone, which ricocheted and wanged off the hull of one of the vehicles, which was exceedingly dangerous, but, you know, people get carried away. So that's a thing that happened. Now I'm going to talk about this: do not denigrate social institutions, or do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. Before really getting into Rule 1, it's probably worth giving a quick introduction. There is an introductory statement that Peterson has made, basically covering his experience in the last year, suffering through all of the medical hardships that he did, and all of the treatments that he endured in Russia and in Bosnia while he was recovering from the benzodiazepine addiction that he found himself in as a result of taking prescription drugs for anxiety. And a little bit of soul searching in there. One thing I would just bring out is that he articulates the reason for this book, because he's basically said that his first book was written based on a Quora list that he had produced a number of years ago, basically generally answering what are some good guidelines that he had learned about how to live. And in his first book, he'd sort of cherry-picked based on his assessment of the need of his audience. And it was very much focused on bringing order into lives that were completely disordered. Now, in this book, he wanted to address something a little more broad and to start talking about how to integrate chaos appropriately into that life. So first we bring order, but then we also have to bring into that order a degree of chaos, because perfect order is not living. We change. We live in a world that is chaotic, and we have to then learn how to integrate those elements of chaos productively into our lives. So that's sort of his overall thesis in the 12 rules that he's presenting now. So the first rule is to not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. It's a really thoughtful way of saying don't go in and smash up the works with a spanner. Like, there's a reason why things are the way that they are. Don't burn the building down, but try to make creative and thoughtful alterations to modify the institution so that it fits more perfectly with the present needs that it was designed to serve. And he gets into a long conversation, probably the first half of that chapter, which is an attempt to try and found his argument in some sort of universal ethic. I'm just going to say this without going into great detail. It's worth reading. But I do find it interesting reading someone like Peterson, who's trying to take a secular approach to providing a foundation for our need of these social institutions. Basically, what he has to say comes down to the world is full of suffering. These institutions are designed to constrain chaos such that it minimizes suffering and maximizes prosperity in this life. And he identifies that basically you can evaluate the effectiveness of these institutions by evaluating how effectively they do those things, which is minimize suffering and maximize prosperity. And he says that there are an essentially unlimited number of problems that can be faced by a human in his walk in this world. What is also true, though, he points out, is that there are an unlimited number of possible solutions, but a very limited number that have proven themselves to be efficacious in having positive outcomes. And so we need to take great care to identify and recognize those that have positive outcomes. And he actually says that this approaches something like a universal ethic, that there is a certain way in which people, when they act in this way, find more profit and prosperity for themselves in community. And the communities who enshrine these ethics and ideals prosper more, enjoy more peace, enjoy more prosperity, enjoy less suffering than those that don't. And obviously that's true. What I will say about it, though, is it's very interesting from the perspective of one who actually holds to the perspective that it is true that what Paul said is we have received a doctrine that leads to salvation that is founded upon the cornerstone of Christ, that whole image we have in Jesus' own parable, which is that there is a house built on a rock and a house built on the sand, and when the waves come in, the house built on the sand washes out to sea. It's destroyed utterly, but the house built on the rock endures. There's something incredibly powerful about having your house built upon a rock. The foundation stone of Christ is one that you can form your arguments off of. You can face the facing of the stone that is Christ gives you something to build your additional foundation stones off of, and you can work from that and build something that endures. When you don't have that, you have to do an awful lot more work to try and build your first foundation stone that somebody who's working off that stone doesn't have to do. So that's like the first half, really, is building his foundation stone for the argument using a more general secular approach. But then he gets on to some really good stuff and some powerful principles for our life as we seek to live it out in the midst of hardship, chaos, and uncertainty, and all of the problems that come in this world. And he addresses the need for institutions and hierarchies for us to be successful. And these hierarchies are natural, and he certainly does turn to evolutionary arguments to suggest that this is a natural conclusion of evolution. One thing he says that I absolutely would reiterate for everybody here is you have to appreciate something, that if you're standing on a secular materialist understanding, that by no means eliminates the argument for the need to hold on to old functional ideologies that have proven themselves. This strange idea that so many have that hold to an evolutionary worldview, that we have evolved past the need for those old institutions, is utterly absurd from any framework. Like, if evolution is the mechanism by which we derive ethics, and it's simply the argument that is being made that it is those institutions which have been proven to constrain human nature in such a way that humans act more productively and more holistically good for the sake of society towards one another, then understand that there's no sensible way in which you could have possibly said that evolution has transformed what humans are in the last 10,000 years of proposed human evolution. Like, there's just no way. We are functionally the same beast, and we act in the same way. And so what worked before is still going to work. Even if there's different influences, the principles must be the same. We have not changed in our nature from the ancient Egyptians. Our worldview may have changed and our perspective may have changed, but the nature of man has not changed. Our impulses are the same. No argument is going to change that. So you have to take this seriously, no matter what your perspective, that we have not functionally changed in such a way as to eliminate the need for those old systems that held in check human greed and human selfishness that destroys society. So that's a valid point that needs to be brought forward. But then, talking about hierarchies, he demonstrates that hierarchies are actually necessary for functional human society. And in part, that's because of the way that we are and the way that we develop as people. And so he articulates a number of stages of development and roles within any hierarchy that must be fulfilled. They are the stage of the fool, the stage of the equal, and the stage of the top dog, or the master, or the teacher. The first stage, he says, he refers to as the utility of the fool. And he's not talking here about somebody who is willfully destructive. He's talking about somebody who is acknowledging themselves to be unlearned and to not have all the answers. Somebody who may be willing to test themselves, and he has that picture of the fool seemingly about to step off a cliff, and he sort of goes on to explain that this is the joy of youth, is that you can test things and jump off the cliff and dust yourself off and heal from your wounds and go on. And to a degree, that's expected of you, that you are the child, you are the one who doesn't know everything, and you have to try everything and try new things, and you bring some element of creativity to the more static aspects of the experienced perspective on how to do things. But he also points out that the fool must recognize that they are a fool and one who needs to learn. That when you enter into any institution, any hierarchy, you must start at the bottom. You must start as one who is willing to learn and prepared to grow by the experience and advice of those who have proven to know more than you know. This is, of course, functionally essential to any sort of good society, that we have that system. I mean, the military, of course, highlights this in a way that I think civilian society in our individualistic Western world has ceased to do well. When you come in as a private soldier or as an officer, cadet, or second lieutenant in a military force, you're not brought in to start advising on the way that the system should work. You're brought in to learn basic skills and to shut your mouth and do what you're told until you've garnered enough experience and proven yourself over years of performance at this trade to have learned and integrated those basic things, those basic systems on such a level that you fully understand them. It's not until much later that you can start providing good, intelligent arguments on ways to modify those principles or the application of the principles that you've learned for better benefit or better performance. You have to come in as the fool. You have to come in as the one who acknowledges they know nothing. You're the blank slate, the dry sponge, just ready to drink up all that is there to be taught to you. And so Peterson provides an example of a young man who approached him when he was out for dinner with his family. He was a waiter there. And he'd come to him and said, look, I listened to a lot of your lectures on YouTube, and I just wanted to thank you because you've transformed my life. Prior to listening to that and really confronting myself about my role in society, I was quite bitter about being ground under the heel of management and not appreciated and not respected. But then I came to see myself as having no right to demand respect because I hadn't yet earned that right. And I changed my whole outlook on my role here as a server in a restaurant. And I just devoted myself to being the best at it that I could be. And he said, since I've done that, I've gotten 3 raises in the last 6 months. And I've been pegged as potentially being in line for management with that potential. And so Peterson, of course, points out that, this is, of course, the way that it should be, that you don't go in holding bitterness in your heart because you're not already at the top. You need to earn that. You need to strive for it. And when you submit, even if the authority over you is imperfect and the mechanisms are not great, you will learn from that. There's that adage we often used in the military that you learn from every boss. Whether it's things to do or things not to do, you learn from them all. And you gain experience as you go. And later on, you can put all of those lessons to good use when you come into a position of authority by having grown and proved yourself. So the utility of the fool is necessary, and you need to enter into every institution in that role. And the second point that he gives us on that road is the necessity of equals, that we must grow out of being a fool into one who has developed enough skill and experience to be able to speak as an equal to others in the modification of the rules and systems, whether it's a restaurant, a religion, or a government, any of these things. You need to grow in your experience until you can become one who's able to debate as an equal on the best ways to modify the application of principles that have proven themselves to address present challenges. And that debate of equals needs to happen for the healthy growth and application of principle. One perspective is not enough. We need to bring all of the perspectives and all of the different experience sets together and come and approach as equals. We can't do it adversarially and actually have productivity. You need to come at it as those who acknowledge that this other person has also good experience and that I should respect their experience even if I disagree with their conclusions. I need to hear them out, and I need to incorporate what they've learned as received wisdom into my own thinking about the current problem. So that's a really wise and sagacious approach to how we have to exist in hierarchy. We can't just have these arguments where we demonize our opponents in a particular conversation. Whatever it is, it can be as simple as how to organize the shift list at a restaurant. It can be as complex as how we deal with racist behavior in our society. When we demonize, we actually close the argument and we no longer have the means of progressing. we come to loggerheads. And that can only increase pressure until there is a violent usurpation of one side or the other, or the total conflagration and destruction of both. So that is absolutely necessary and true. And of course, it's also derived from biblical principle that, as one man, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. We must approach these things with humility. We must bear one another's burdens with gentleness and love, and seek to encourage one another towards the truth. We don't simply attack and destroy those that are outside of what we think is the best practice. We need to work together and hear them out, and not simply hold our own position as though this received tradition of our own was the only mechanism by which we can faithfully express the principles of truth that we have received. The final point that he brings up is the hierarchical position of the top dog. And that top dog is the one who has, through decades of service in a particular field, grown and experienced to the point where they have greater insight and wisdom, and they have assumed a position of authority. He makes an important distinction between authority and power in that conversation, but he says, authority is necessary because, of course, without authority, we have chaos. We cannot rule by true democracy. The majority is never right, right? We need somebody in authority who has earned that position and has gained the insights and wisdom that will allow them to serve others through their authoritative expression of rule. And every hierarchy needs that. You need somebody to control the restaurant. Somebody has to make the final decision on how you're going to split up the wait staff, how you're going to organize the various duties and responsibilities, how the compensation is going to work. Somebody needs to make that decision who has an overarching understanding of all of the different workers in that restaurant, whether it's the wait staff, the bus boys, the chef, his sous chefs, the other cooks, the folks who run deliveries. Like, all of that needs to be taken into consideration and properly put in its place by somebody who sees the whole picture and is willing to do what is in the best interests of the restaurant and its various employees. Obviously, this works that way in the military. It should work that way in government at all levels and in every other institutional body. If we don't have a top dog and we only have fools and equals, then the equals can't resolve points of conflict. However, if we do have a top dog, then the equals can all have their say, and he can make a decision as a judge and arbitrate those points of conflict where there is no resolution and determine what's going to be done. That's necessary for function. Okay? And the whole point of saying this is he's highlighting pragmatically what must be for functional human relationship in any significant population, any significant grouping. I mean, even the family has to work in this way for it to work well. A family in which everybody is an equal creates a deal of conflict, and it doesn't function as it should. There is, biblically speaking, and one would argue sociologically speaking, a proper hierarchy and distribution of roles within family. And a father should be a father. He should be the one who sacrificially serves his wife and his children, but he does that in part by exercising authority to make the decisions in points of conflict that are in the best interest of the family to the best of his own wisdom. And without that, when you have this modern concept of equality in the leadership even of a family, and I'm going beyond what Peterson's articulating here, but I'm just taking it into a field that of practical application, you're going to have any time that there is a disagreement which isn't resolved equitably through conversation, which I would argue, even living out a hierarchical marriage relationship with my own wife, where she expects me to be the spiritual leader of the home, it's exceedingly rare, if ever, that I can see a time when we came to that place where I ever had to really overrule her. There was, disagreements, and ultimately we worked them out, and there's a degree of deference given to the authority of the father and husband of the home, according to biblical teaching. But it works so well to do that, because you functionally have already agreed that I take the final responsibility, and if it goes wrong, I take that responsibility as well and have to own up to it and humble myself and apologize, but we agree that someone has to make final decisions. That's how any social structure works. The officer and his senior NCO are equals, absolutely. And the senior NCO is listened to by his officer. But at the end of the day, they both acknowledge that the officer makes the final decision so that they can get on with doing stuff. And if he's wrong, then the officer takes the full brunt of the rebuke and the responsibility for failure. This is just what works. We need somebody to be that top dog, and we have to give deference to that person out of the interests of the functioning of that group. Now, of course, this is all very general stuff, but there is one example that Peterson provides that really brings home the functionality and practicality of this. And it's this one. He presents a story in which a friend had asked him to talk to a niece that was in a difficult situation. And this was when he was practicing as a clinician. So we got in touch with her, had a productive conversation on seeking meaning and purpose in life. Now, this young woman was in a very bad place, as he describes her, having basically given up on life and saying that she had no reason to live and would probably already have committed suicide, at least that's implied, except that she had a feeling of responsibility towards a pet that she had the care of. And beyond that, she saw no purpose in life. And so he said that they had this conversation, and she was there fully filling the role of a fool, one who knew that she had nothing figured out, and was approaching him as someone who was a top dog, a teacher, somebody who had earned the right to speak authoritatively about ways in which she could reorder her life, change her perspective in order to have a more positive encounter or experience with seeking meaning and purpose in her own life. So that was very profitable for, a solid hour or so of conversation. And then he said something very strange happened. The subject of environmentalism came up. And all of a sudden, the entire tone of the conversation shifted. She brought it up, and he presented an opinion that this was not worth her fixating on at this point, because she had no control over it, and she needed to work on the things that she could actually influence. And then she suddenly shifted in the tone of the conversation, and no longer was she a fool talking to a top dog. Suddenly the conversation became a dialogue of equals, where she was presuming, in all of her confusion and acknowledged brokenness in her understanding of how to live, she presumed to be his teacher, one who could debate on equal footing with him about the vital centrality of environmentalism to all of our approach to understanding the world, and to instruct and harass him on this matter. And he basically said, at this point, I discerned that this conversation would not be profitable, and I politely ended our conversation. This is so important. See, when you look at the world, you see this is one of the most tragic flaws in the way that we converse as societies today. Those people who are most confused and most troubled by anxiety and depression and confusion about how to live their life are presuming the most authority to demand that we acknowledge their perspective of various major social issues, whether it's racism, whether it's sexual affiliation or conduct, whether it's family structure, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's social justice, whether it's capitalism versus socialism. And they are not speaking as those who are actually talking to equals. They're talking as top dogs. They're talking without having earned any experience from which to speak. They're conversing with other people's arguments that they have received unquestioningly, and they're presenting those as their own arguments into every field of conversation, speaking as though they had authority to speak, as though they had the right to declare what right was as governors, having done nothing to prove that they had gained any respectability to be deemed worthy of participating in the conversation in the first place. And I find this particularly true in the conversation about spiritual needs. So I will speak as humbly as I can on this, because I know myself and I know how much I need to learn. But I find it very interesting that I am a man who found a real powerful faith in Christ when I was 17 years of age, or before I joined the army. I have experienced quite a bit in my life, and I dare say that at 39, I've encountered a lot more variety of philosophy and human experience than a lot of people my age. I have had the worth of my spiritual life tested in difficult family situations. I do have 6 kids. I've had to face the mortality of my own children. I've had to put that to the test of faith. I have lost many friends, many acquaintances that I respected to suicide, many others that are still broken in mental and emotional hardship as a result of things that we did together. I've gone to the darkest places that speak of human depravity on levels that are just incomprehensible to somebody who's grown up in a Western society. And even if you've seen the depths of the darkness of what we have to offer, and it gets pretty dark, it is a different thing when, in order to enjoy continued freedom to enjoy your hedonistic lifestyle, you must kill and take from others, and there is nothing to stop you from doing it. So, Haiti, Afghanistan, combat, killing, death, being confronted with having to actually watch children die and being powerless to help, Like, I've been to some stuff. I've been through some stuff, and I've studied a lot, you know? Like for 22 years I've made a pretty significant effort to study and understand faith and spirituality and to know my God. And I find it amazing how many people that have actually basically listened to some YouTube videos are willing to tell me that I don't know anything about faith and that all of my proven power of God in my life is obviously false because I haven't paid enough attention to some Gnostic heresy from 200 AD, which probably I've read more than most of you have anyway, or that I haven't properly understood the teaching of this or that branch of mysticism, or I haven't understood the Vedas, or I haven't understood the Tao, or I haven't understood the Buddhist teachings, or I haven't understood the Orthodox teachings. It's like, yeah, I mean, fine, but I'll tell you what I can tell you, which is that the God that I have found through Christ in my Western backwards Protestant approach to Christianity has proven to be incredibly powerful to overcome all of the hardships of this world and to provide a peace and a security and a powerful hope and a knowledge of truth and many profoundly mystical experiences. So take it or leave it, I guess, because you denigrate the social institution you come from at your peril. Don't presume to grab hold of somebody else's tradition and understand the consequences of that tradition. You don't even live in that world, and you haven't seen where that tradition goes. I've, talked about this a fair bit in my videos, but you need to take care that you just jump out of a tradition that you come from and you ignore all of the claims of goodness that come out of it from those who have participated in it, and you just dump it out on the floor and say, no, I'm not taking it. I know better than you. Like, okay, man, like, maybe you should listen to somebody who has actually walked that walk first and let the grown-ups talk to each other about the exact way in which to apply the principles of biblical teaching to the present problems faced in our world. Maybe that sounds insulting. It's not meant to be insulting. It's meant to say you need to come in like a child and you need to learn and not presume to jump on everything and teach before you even have any understanding of the deep things that are the nature of and the source of any sort of conflicts between these various ideas. The concluding remarks that Peterson makes in this chapter, he goes to Christ, to Jesus, and he points out that Jesus presents the role of the equal and the top dog with great care. As a child, he presents that Jesus went to the temple, and of course, he comes into the world as a fool, as a baby, as one who knows nothing and has to grow in understanding. And of course, the scripture presents that he does that. Then Jesus is presented at 13, going to the temple and debating with the great teachers in the temple and speaking as an equal, one who is in submission to the honor accorded to those who are worthy teachers, but one who is speaking to them about the interpretation of the laws as an equal. And then he's presented as the one who confronts those institutional applications of the law's principles in his role as the Sabbath breaker, when he goes and he contends against the Pharisees and Sadducees' application of the principles, the traditions, and he conforms those traditions by breaking their understanding of the Sabbath and basically saying that on the grounds that David also did this when it was necessary. And it's not that the man was made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. We need to take these principles and apply them rightly in our context, not without love and not to the detriment of man. So he does that, but he does it after having 20 years of having grown up and grown in his own understanding and his own credibility and growing into maturity. Only then does he confront even the false teachers of his own age. And he does it with a gentleness and with a degree of respect for quite a bit of that conversation. It's not until the very end that he goes and stands and lays curses against them for refusing to acknowledge their error. So if that's Jesus Christ, and he's presenting him as an example of the way in which we should approach these things, not throwing out the law, but with great wisdom and having earned authority by proving that our application of the law has been efficacious, then do we take the risk of actually modifying its application in the context that we are presently in. Very important. Now, I told a story which you may think totally unrelated at the beginning, and there is a relation to what we're talking about. See, that particular situation where the young soldier fell down the well and busted himself up some good, in the bottom of the well, he was basically powerless to pull himself out of the well. He couldn't have responded to any amount of cajoling to drag himself up out of that well. He couldn't have MacGyvered himself a solution to get himself up out of that well. And any amount of counsel to do that would have been utterly pointless. He was one who needed to be helped in that position. And he needed to wait upon somebody else to come and to rescue him. That is your place as you enter into any institution. Like, you're not coming in as the one who's going to save everyone else and fix their problems. You're kind of busted up at the bottom of the well right now. You need to wait for others to come and to lead you back out of it. There were those who were solving the problem as equals, and there was quite a bit of debate in the midst of that very tense situation as to how we were going to solve this problem with the materials at hand. And you know what? We repurposed some items that did not originally serve that purpose in order to solve the problem of a dude being at the bottom of a well unable to pull himself out. The toe straps were not meant for what we were using them for, but it worked. And you needed sort of a combining of minds of people to come together and offer different solutions so that we could come to the answer. You also needed the Sergeant Major there who was overseeing the medevac so that was done properly. You needed me on the radio to make sure that everything was being coordinated and the helicopters were there as soon as we could possibly evacuate this guy and not before, so that it sat on the ground being endangered by a potential attack. You needed commanders that were leading the defense to prevent somebody from the outside from coming in and disrupting the effort. And all of this had to be done in hierarchy. But you don't start by presuming that when you have basically found yourself at the bottom of the well, that you're then going to start criticizing the guy at the top for using the wrong rope to pull you out. That cargo strap wasn't designed for that. According to tradition, you can only use a proper mountaineering rope to get me out of this well. This isn't the right harness. That gator shouldn't be here. It's not designed for this purpose. It's not a sufficient mechanism for pulling me up out of this well. Like sitting at the bottom of the well, trying to pull yourself back out and saying, well, I don't really think that the sergeant major should be citing the HLZ over there. It should be better cited over here. Like, you know what? Shut your hole and keep yourself alive and wait for somebody to haul you out of the hole. Do what they tell you. Let them tie you up so that you're safe and get you out of there. And maybe 20 years from now, when you're the sergeant major, then you can make arguments about exactly where the HLZ should be cited. You follow? Like, I'm not saying everyone listening to me is in that place, but when you're in a broken state and you are in need of help, stop whining about the way in which somebody is coming to provide that help. Stop looking at the mechanisms that have served our society for like 2,000 years and have brought people light out of the darkness and hope that overcomes all despair, and saying, I don't like the way you're doing that. That was the wrong way to do it. I'm going to go find my own way. Nonsense. Don't carelessly denigrate social institutions. Don't carelessly denigrate the systems of politics that have got us where we are. Don't carelessly denigrate the institution of your workplace. And do not be a fool and presume to have greater understanding than those who built your society before it got broken in secularism, founded upon Jesus Christ as the answer, as the hope of man, and the millions of voices professing the power of this to lift them into a new life of power and freedom and ability to serve others, and then just throw it on the ground. So, that's Beyond Order Rule 1 as applied by this particular old soldier. And I hope that you have some benefit from it. And if you have comments or you want to argue with me in the comments, by all means do so. I'm always good for a good row. And if you have any conversation points, then certainly put them there as well. Godspeed, and I wish you the best. I look forward to having another conversation soon on Rule 2.